Hello and welcome to Composer's Lab, Session 5, Franz Peter Schubert. What we just heard is kind of a free rendition of the opening of his so-called unfinished symphony. Now, the unfinished symphony is something that he left unfinished. We're actually looking at his manuscript here, and you can see it's kind of unfinished, actually, the way it looks, very, very much like a sketch, but actually the note writing is very clear. So we're going to talk about the unfinished symphony in a few minutes, but here is the portrait of Schubert. This is one of the portraits that was done by an artist who was one of his friends. In fact, he did portraits of the Schubert circles, and we'll see some of those portraits later too. I like this portrait because, to me, it actually gives out the nature of Schubert. He's kind of tender, he's kind of focused, but he's all introverted in this picture, and that's how we know he was in his life. In fact, when I was preparing this presentation today, I thought, well, there's so many composers who, traveled extensively, who had all these different kinds of jobs that were, this and that. And then Schubert actually led a very quiet life. He was born in Vienna. Okay, and here's another portrait of Schubert, very indicative too. He was born in Vienna. His father was a school teacher, so his father definitely wanted the young Franz to follow his steps and be a school teacher, and in fact he did on and off throughout his very short life. Schubert only lived 31 years, not even, and he was actually buried next to Beethoven's grave, as was his last wish. And then both graves, in fact, were transferred later to a different site in a sort of a premium Vienna cemetery, where Johannes Brahms was also buried later, and Johannes Strauss Jr., the son, the king of waltz, was buried there. Here's this picture of Vienna that we looked at in relation to Beethoven. I really like this one. It kind of shows it from the outskirts, and it's almost like you're approaching Vienna, right? I think it gives a real spirit of this. For those who like maps, here is a vintage map of Vienna done in the year of 1800. So right then and there where Schubert was there. So Schubert, his musical upbringing was also started in the family. In fact, it's an interesting fact that they had a string quartet in the family, and the young Schubert played the viola, his father played the cello, and two other brothers played the violins. And some of his first compositions were actually for that quartet, and some of his first knowledge was from his father. And later, when he went to school there in Vienna, he was also studying with an organist there, and in fact gained his first knowledge of actual music theory from there, from that school. And he was also introduced to the music of Haydn and Mozart, also in that school. Somebody else who he met and took lessons from on and off was this gentleman. This is Antonio Salieri. Now, there's this whole story about whether Mozart was killed by Salieri or poisoned by him or what, but they were actually good friends. And Salieri, he was kind of like a commercial composer, right? Like maybe Tin Pan Alley of New York City in the 1920s of the previous century, right? Something like this. So he actually composed music for occasions. He had commissions. He had students. He was a well-respected composer and well-respected teacher. So Schubert, in fact, learned a lot of his compositional techniques from Salieri. And also, of course, Schubert was very aware of Mozart's music and Beethoven's music specifically, because Beethoven was right there in Vienna as well at one point. And so Schubert absolutely revered Beethoven. He was at his funeral. He was actually a torchbearer. And when he did that, he recognized that some of his form structuring and some of his dynamics handling was from Beethoven. Now, here's some couple of interesting people in Schubert's life. This gentleman here, his name is Ensalm Holtenbrunner. Now, he was a composer in his own right, and he actually was a mutual friend of both Beethoven and Schubert. In fact, he was one of only two people who saw Beethoven's very last moments on his deathbed. And he was the one who was instrumental in Schubert's life later on, promoting Schubert's music and basically actively helping him in many different ways. Now, what I'd like to do right now is introduce some of the vocal music by Schubert. And to do that, we have a very talented singer here who also lives and works here in Orlando with us, Alexandra Vargas. Please welcome Alexandra. And she's going to introduce herself, and she's going to tell us what we're about to show you. Some fragments of different art songs by Schubert called also Lieder, as in lead being a song. Alexandra?
Sergei, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to talk about Schubert. A bit about myself. My name is Alexandra Vargas, and I am a voice teacher and classically trained singer. And I teach locally, and I sing locally, and I also have a YouTube channel, if you want to see it, Alexandra Vargas, where I give voice lessons. So today we are going to present a few pieces from some of his most famous Lieder, and we are going to start with one called Stenhin, or Serenade. And this is from a group of songs called the Swan Song. So this is from a collection of his last works. So Stenhin.
And by the way, this is Schubert's original manuscript, so you'll see the piece in question starts right there on the bottom part of this page and continues into the next.
Leise fliehen meine Lieder durch die Nacht zu dir. In den stillen Hain hernieder, Liebchen, komm zu mir. Flüstert's lange Wimpel rauschen in des Mondes Licht, in des Mondes Licht. Des Verräters feindlich Lauchen wüsste Hulde nicht, wüsste Hulde nicht. The next excerpt is from Gretchen am Spinnrade, and this is from a poem by the great German writer Goethe from Faust. And Gretchen is a character who has committed an atrocious sin, and she is sitting at a spinning wheel, and the piano, the accompaniment, shows the progress of the spinning wheel and as well as her mind unraveling. So she's going mad in this particular piece. Meine Ruhe ist hin, mein Herz ist schwer. Ich finde sie nimmer und nimmer mehr. Wo ich ihn nicht hab, ist mir das Grab. Die ganze Welt ist mir vergällt. Mein armer Kopf ist mir verrückt. Mein armer Sinn ist mir zerstückt.
Etc. You can definitely hear the spinning wheel here, and it constantly goes through a very good symbol in this case of somebody losing their mind through the repetitive action like this.
Our next piece, Das Wandern, comes from Schubert's song cycle, Die schöne Müllerin, or The Beautiful Miller Maid. It is from the point of view of a young man, a young miller, who wanders the countryside and falls in love with a miller's daughter. The romance doesn't go well, but this particular piece, the beginning of it, is a happy one. It talks about him walking through the countryside and how happy he is to be a free and wandering miller.
And in fact, again, you hear something in the accompaniment that is a very descriptive. The mill and the way the song is written. Just look for a second at this before we sing it. Look for at the score, and you will see that the first page is this, and the second page, right here, has a repeat sign at the end, so it goes right to the beginning, and you have verses 2, 3, 4, and 5. So the piece really never stops, and then we go to the first page, and we keep cycling like that 5 times, and then you see in the fourth measure there's a ending there. So that is the ending of the piece. A very compact way of writing, almost reminds me of what we do today with jazz charts and such.
Wandern ist des Mülles Lust, das Wandern. Das Wandern ist des Mülles Lust, das Wandern. Das muss ein schlechter Müller sein, denn dem ist viel das Wandern. Nein, das Wandern, das Wandern, das Wandern, das Wandern.
Something like this.
And our final piece that we're going to show is Ave Maria. Now, it's familiar to a lot of people as being one that's sung a lot for Christmas in Catholic Mass, but it was actually written for a series of poems by Sir Walter Scott's Lady of the Lake. This is a story about two medieval Scottish rival factions, and this lady is caught in the middle because she is in love with a young man from a rival faction but belongs to another, so kind of a Romeo and Juliet type story. And in this piece, she's praying to the Virgin Mary to keep her beloved safe while the two rival factions go to war.
And of course it continues. There are 3 verses to it. They're all in German. You've noticed that the original text, of course, is in German. And to me, it's always refreshing to hear something that was actually the composer's writing, not an editor's work. Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you.
We are going to have you back at the end of this presentation. Not to spoil things, but we will not tell you what we're going to be doing. It's going to be something really, really exciting and scary. Well, for now, let's see if we can now get a taste of kind of like what it was like in Schubert's time to have these private events. Some composers were very popular and performed a lot, just like today. Same kind of an idea for an industry, if you will. If you're writing something that's commercially viable, that people love, that's accessible, and it's simple enough and it's engaging enough, you're going to have big audiences, you're going to have big sponsors, big money, nice clothes, all of that. If you're writing art music like Schubert did, it definitely limits his market because a lot of people just want to be entertained. They really don't want to think, and they don't want to have these complex feelings expressed, perhaps. And then what happens is these kinds of composers and that kind of music finds its way into people's homes and into private events. And here is one of them. Again, this is a drawing that is Schubert's time. So you have a few people here that are worth noting. Next to Schubert, that really tall gentleman is the singer by the last name of Vogel. Now, Vogel and Schubert actually worked together on several projects. He was the first performer of many of his pieces, and he was definitely also helping popularize Schubert's music throughout the Vienna circles by virtue of being an opera singer and being well known to the public. Pretty much anything that he approves of and endorses would be accepted well. And that's what led to eventually to these circles of friends and their acquaintances gathering together in homes, people's homes, and they called it Schubertiades. Now, okay, so Schubert was at the piano, and Vogel was probably singing a lot of that too, and I'm sure others were singing too. And you see the people on the right side of the screen are basically the audience, right? They came here to witness the magic of Schubert and his friends performing music. There is also somebody in Schubert's life that we should mention. It's a lady. She was the daughter of Count Esterhazy. Now, not the same exact family member of Esterhazy that hosted Haydn, but the same noble name and same family clan, if you will. So Schubert was invited to teach lessons. 2 summers he did it, one summer, and then a few years later another summer. So he was teaching these 2 daughters music theory and piano, and even wrote a double piano feature that is clearly meant for these 2 ladies. And apparently, from what we know from their accounts, that she was a very skilled pianist. And of course, Schubert had feelings for her. It never really went anywhere. She eventually married another count, of course, as many of these stories go. But when you hear the music in those salons, in fact, if we go back to this picture, somebody claims that the portrait in the back of the room is the portrait of Countess Caroline Esterhazy, this same lady here. And let it be, because we can actually relate to it a little better than we know that there's somebody that they personally knew that was kind of almost like in the role of a muse, perhaps. A muse. So something like this would be played at those events. And then as you see on the next page, he has these very interesting corrections. For instance, the very first line has this insert. right? So here's how the music goes. And then, oh, he forgot about that measure. And then it goes up one octave. So in a very nonchalant way, as you can see on the screen there, he just says, oops, I forgot that measure. And then the way he puts it in that little hourglass kind of a window, you know, I think I'd like to borrow that from him, because sometimes I have a need to do that too when I write on paper. It's like, how do I insert so that it's legible and readable? Well, that's how, guys. So the measure lines are not matching in the top insert and the bottom insert, right? But you can actually match them kind of with your perceptual sense, like this, right? So that just shows you how he was very fast, even when he's trying to write something like this, which looks more like a finished rendition. He would still, you know, just spur of the moment changes and things like that. On the third system of staves, you will see that he uses a repeat sign. So those two measures. And then it goes back. So basically, he's very, he takes liberties when he writes his music. Now, this one piece that we started with, the Unfinished Symphony, right? So. And that's the theme. But what I'd like to show you is a few pages down. So here's this first page, second page, third page, the theme we just heard. Right after the whole exposition, which is of course the exposition of the main themes, and usually in the form of the sonata allegro, which is the building part of most sonatas and symphonies, kind of like the bread and butter of it. The very first movement is usually written in that form structure with two main themes and then their development and their recap at the end with the change of a key. So what I'd like to show you is this part from the development section. Now, the symphony opens, in fact, with this motif in the main key, but the development starts with the motif in the key of the so-called subdominant. But it doesn't stay there, it goes somewhere, and look what we see here. Now, I'm going to ask you, whose music does this remind you of? If it weren't Schubert, who could this be of later years? It goes like this. So I don't know what your answer is. I'll tell you my answer. My answer would be Tchaikovsky. So you have these violins playing in octaves, which isn't necessarily how the classics before Schubert wrote their arrangements. Usually, if the violins are playing here, you will have some other instrument, perhaps violas or clarinets, or if the violins play lower, let's say if they were playing here, you might have a bassoon playing the lower part like that, together with them one octave apart. But in this case, he actually uses a lot of violins, first and second groups of violins, playing in octave like this. First violins on top and the second on the bottom. And what that does is that actually creates this more of a, I would call it more of a popular sound, you know, something that we associate today with Broadway, Hollywood, but it wasn't them who started this. It was Schubert, and then what happened when, you know, people were studying his work later on, and it was more and more popularized after his death. Tchaikovsky definitely knew the symphony, and I can almost guarantee that if Tchaikovsky was here with us today, that we would ask him whether he was influenced by this when he wrote something like this. That's Tchaikovsky, okay, and here compare with Schubert. I hope you can hear the similarity in this, and that does not mean that Tchaikovsky stole from Schubert. Just the opposite. It actually means that Tchaikovsky took that line and ran with it and developed it further, and from Tchaikovsky now comes a lot of our show music that we come to know and love from the 20th century onwards, but it all traces back to the Vienna masters like Beethoven and Schubert. So to finish our presentation, we would like to show you another vocal piece, and Alexandra Vargas is here with us again. This is going to be something and something else. And Alexandra, please tell us what we're about to hear.
Okay, well, we are about to perform Die Erlkönig, and this is a very big lieder piece. It's very well known for anybody who studies classical singing. And Die Erlkönig, Schubert wrote a lot of his music for a particular singer in mind, Vogel in this case. And this is one of their first successes together. And the Erlkönig is based on a poem by Goethe again. And this has 4 characters, so the whole piece is like an opera within a song. It starts with a father and a son riding, really fast through the forest, and you could hear that in the accompaniment of the horse riding through. And the narrator says, "Who is this that is riding so late through the woods?" It's a father and his son. So they're riding, and then the father notices that the son is trying to cover his face, and he asks him, "What's wrong?" And the child replies that the elf king is talking to him, an elf king with a tail and a crown, and he's trying to get him to go into the woods with him. The father doesn't believe it. He tries to calm the child down and says it's just the rustling of the leaves. The child continues to say no, it's the elf king, and the elf king shows up, and he sings this song, and he's trying to seduce the child into going into the woods. So this back and forth between the father, the elf king, and the child goes all the way up to the end, and then the father arrives at his destination, and he looks into his arms, and his son is dead. The way this is written portrays 4 characters. Schubert has the narrator sing in a middle range, the child sings in the highest part of the singer's range, the father in the lowest range, and the elf king, you can tell it's the elf king by the mid-range and also the creepy accompaniment that goes under him, because when the father's singing, it's the horse riding through the forest.
To that, I'd like to add that it's a very challenging piece for the piano. In fact, I saw the first manuscript, and it didn't have this fast pulsing. Like if you look at the score, you'll see. da 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 da, and it goes all through the piece. But his first manuscript actually has da 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 in 4, which is interesting. I thought that maybe he wrote that, and perhaps his friends or publishers said, you know, it can be better than that. And it is now. So we're going to perform the entire piece for you, called Erlkönig.
So spät durch Nacht und Wind. Es ist der Vater mit seinem Kind. Er hat den Knaben wohl in dem Arm. Er fasst ihm sicher, er hält ihn warm. Mein Sohn, was birgst du so bang dein Gesicht? Siehst, Vater, du, den erkenn ich nicht. Den Erling kenn ich mit Kron und Schweif. Mein Sohn, es ist ein Nebelstreif. Du liebes Kind, komm, geh mit mir, gar schöne Spiele spiel ich mit dir. Manch bunte Blumen sind an dem Strand, meiner Mutter hat man gülden gewandt. Mein Vater, und Herr ist du nicht, was den König mir leise verspricht. Sei ruhig, bleib ruhig, mein Kind, in dürren Blättern säuselt der Wind. Willst, feine Knaben, du mit mir gehen? Deine Töchter sollen dich warten schön. Meine Töchter führen den nächtlichen Rhein und wiegen und tanzen und singen dich ein. Und wiegen und tanzen und singen dich ein. Mein Vater, und siehst du nicht dort? Erkenn ich Tochter und düster Nord. Mein Sohn, ich sehe es genau, es scheinen die alten Weiden so grau. Ich liebe dich, mich reizt deine schöne Gestalt, und bist du nicht willig, so brauch ich Gewalt. Mein Vater, jetzt fasst mich an. Der König hat mir ein Leid getan. Dem Vater grauset's, reitet geschwind, hält in Armen das hüpfende Kind. Reicht den Hof mit Mundnot. In seinen Armen das Kind war tot.
Thank you. So you can see this is really a whole symphony for vocals and piano. Now, I hope you could hear all these characters there. This is very interesting how he treats the accompaniment, as Alexandra said. So it goes from this, the horse gallop, to this for the seductive speeches of the Earl Koenig, or this. All right, and then for child crying, in fact, you have these dissonances like this between the voice and the piano, and that's definitely done on purpose. What I'd like to show you is the last page of the autograph. Now, this is the first edition, and let's look at that page for a second, and then we'll look at the autograph page. So, at the very end, you know, was dead, right? The last two words, and after that, there are two chords. This edition says forte, loud, and it says andante. So, is dead, right? Boom, boom, like this. What do we see in Schubert's autograph? So here's that autograph I was mentioning with the in 4. It would go like this, not nearly as you know, fearsome as the final version, but in fact, I just played for you at the very end of what we just did the last two chords from this version. I personally believe that is how Schubert intended it originally, and I also believe that the publisher said, well, that's not a very strong ending, so let's do a very standard cadence here like this, with the dominant 7th chord and the tonic chord in the nuance of forte. So boom, boom, and everybody claps. But what does Schubert write? Is dead, and then instead of this chord, he writes this chord. Now, very different sound. So the problem with this harmonically would be that we have parallel octaves. Now, today in pop, rock, even jazz, parallel octaves are, or fifths, in fact, are a signature of the genre. You know, the power chords, right? Those kinds of things. Those are called power chords, so they're based on the fifth and octaves, and they go in parallel, okay? So perhaps Schubert actually wanted that color, and he wrote double piano, pianissimo, super soft, for dead. And that's how I believe we should play this piece. At least I'm going to play it like this, because there's no need to like really have giant applause just because we had two big chords at the end. The applause, I think, is deserved because of just the magnitude of the emotional content of this piece, and with a good performance, when it all comes out, you will definitely have chills and thrills and goosebumps every time it's played. And we do as we perform it too. I hope you can see that. Alexandra, thank you very much. It is time for us to go to the open forum. Now, the open forum is something that we have at the end of each of our sessions, and we feature local performers that are usually work with somebody I know. It's usually people that I work with, and let's see if we can have them on screen here. There we go. Okay, so here we have, on the top right of the screen, we have Julian Bond, my very good friend and colleague. Hello, Julian. And next to me on the screen, we have Konstantin Dimitrov, also a friend and colleague of mine. He is a violinist. Hello, Konstantin. Julian is a pianist and composer. And he and I worked together on numerous projects, including playing Moroccan electropop. So something that's very, very unusual, but usual for us, professional musicians. And then Konstantin and I play a lot in orchestras, and we also play as a duo. So let me first ask Julian. I'd like to know, Julian, what your take on Schubert's piano music is. Is it written well? And I think the answer is yes. But what are some of the features that you think set him apart from other composers? What did he start with his piano writing? And maybe some other stories from your personal life, as I'm sure you've played some chamber music and piano music by Schubert. If you could just tell us your take on it.
Well, to answer your question, yes, his piano writing is extremely good. He, most of what I get to play in terms of Schubert tends to be as an accompanist, accompanying singers. And of course, Schubert wrote, I think, over 600 songs, so there's plenty to choose from. The thing that makes Schubert stand out from his predecessors like Beethoven is the fact that he tended to write accompaniments that were kind of metaphorical representations, pictures of what the songs were about. A lot more descriptive, and he made the accompaniments as important as the vocal line. It wasn't just a convenient delivery method for the tune. It actually had its own character and its own sense of awareness. Something I did find out about Schubert long after I started playing his work was that in fact he didn't get a piano until the last year of his life. He was pretty poor all of his life, and these Schubertiads you mentioned tended to kind of pop up in the homes of wealthy people, and he would kind of go to those homes and play their pianos. A lot of what he wrote really came out of his head, and then he would go find a piano and try them and make some alterations. And as you said, that sometimes the manuscript would change, or he'd add something or alter something. So because he was writing in his head, a lot of his piano writing style was almost orchestral in its nature. He would carry a melody in the actual piano, but in between the fingers there would be very often moving parts and moving notes that you might associate with a string quartet. So his orchestral thinking was very similar to his piano thinking. You'll notice that there are very few pedal markings in his music. That might suggest the fact that he wasn't really sitting at a piano when he wrote most of this. Also, he was, as you said, he was a huge fan of Beethoven, and I think his last 3 sonatas were probably his greatest sonatas, and those were written in the last year of his life after Beethoven died. And I'm sure the shock of his mentor dying moved him a lot. But I think Beethoven being such an extrovert and such a show-off, Schubert was not really a show-off. He tended to be a little bit more intimate in his writing and his playing. So I think after Beethoven died, it kind of freed Schubert up a little bit to kind of go, okay, the pressure's off. I can now, I can write with a little bit more freedom without having to try and keep up with Beethoven. And in fact, you'll actually, I believe, and you might know which one this is, I believe it's his C minor sonata. He actually quotes Beethoven in one of those sonatas. I don't remember exactly where it is, and I wish I had the music in front of me. I just love the pictorial representation and the painting, the musical painting that he does with his accompaniments in his songs. And by the way, that was a fabulous performance of the Earl König. I prefer the even eighths rather than the triplets, only because my arm starts to ache if I play that. So you did a fabulous job with that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, this is on the scale of sports, for real.
Yeah.
Playing this piece. But yes, I think I've tried it both ways, and I tend to gravitate towards the triplets. But yes, you have to kind of cheat, and you think in times of Schubert, the pianos were what we now call Viennese action, right? So they are, just basically like a modern toy piano, just the lever of the key and the hammer directly on it. No mechanics, no double repetition, none of that fancy stuff. And so, how would you play this rather than cheat? Maybe something like this, in the middle when the chords are going. I think that would actually be acceptable because it almost sounds like a string tremolo, and in arrangements you would actually write it as such, as a broken tremolo, you know.
Definitely.
And I was going to comment on what you said. Another composer that I know of that wrote like that completely in his head is Berlioz. Berlioz did not play the piano at all. Like he probably could play a few notes, but he didn't. He wasn't a pianist per se. You know, from what I know, he actually studied guitar, and that was his first instrument. And so when he started writing, it was really in his head, and that's how he continued to write. Whereas other composers, like Tchaikovsky, would actually check all of their harmonies on the piano and make sure all the voice leading works the way they like. But yeah, I appreciate your insights.
Sure.
Thank you, Julian. Let's hear from Konstantin. Konstantin, you are violinist, you're concertmaster of one of the orchestras here, and you play a lot of solo, and you've played in your native Bulgaria, in the Bulgarian Chamber Orchestra. You were the concertmaster of that. So I know that you played some Schubert. Can you tell us your take on the violin music, the strings music, string quartets, or whatever you want to tell us about that?
Well, in terms of violin music, Schubert didn't wrote much. I think 3 sonatinas and 1 fantasia for violin and piano, which is a big chamber work. But he's better known for his chamber works, especially his quartets and his trios. Keeping in mind that he was a viola player, his writing for violin is very convenient, very comfortable for the hands. And music-wise, you know, I would say that he reminds me, to me, he takes the episode from Mozart Concerti, let's say. This is the theme which comes instead of development in some pieces of Mozart. Really intimate, really emotional little theme which Mozart used to throw in there instead of. And then for Schubert, this is the main theme, but in Beethoven's form, way more expanded than the classical composers. And that makes him very, very interesting composer and very emotional. Unfortunately, not very much played, but considering that chamber music is not that popular, we know why, but probably few of the best chamber pieces ever written are by Schubert. Also, another thing which is rarely played is his Ninth Symphony, the the Grand Symphony in C major.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is the beginning of the expanding of the symphonic form in the Romanticism. Yes, Beethoven form was expanded, but this symphony is just unbelievably humongous as a form. And it's a beautiful piece, but unfortunately not very often played. As a matter of fact, for the first performance, the orchestra in Vienna said that this is not playable symphony, so they refused to play it.
But then they said that about Bach's music, they said that about Beethoven's music. I think any music that's not square dance based is going to cause that, probably. Don't you think?
But I don't know, from when it comes to Schubert, yes, there are plenty of big pieces which are great to play. I still love to play the most 5 minuets and 6 trios. I think it's coming from his German dances, but this is great piece for a string quartet. And very much unknown, again.
Right. Well, you know what happened to chamber music is pretty much our modern, rock bands that take over big stadiums and draw crowds of, tens of thousands of people. Well, they are pretty much the new chamber music, if you will, all right? So it is now possible because of the amplification. Ever since that was invented, it's possible to make 6 or 5 or 4 people sound like orchestra and choir and 2 organs, you know. So I think chamber music, I would venture to say though that there is a certain revival going on, because, you know, it's kind of like I always say to students and even just to myself, I say square cars, round cars, square cars, round cars, and things like that. So that just shows to illustrate that the taste change, but it also goes kind of like in a spiral to where older things take on new meanings after you've tried something else to try to negate the old, and then the old comes back kind of enhanced by that, you know. And so I think maybe, hopefully, our children and children of our children will not only not drop or stop playing classical and chamber music specifically, that they would hopefully play more of it as we get sort of saturated with the electronic sound and beat-based music. Sometimes the ear actually wants to relax from that and hear something like a Schubert quartet. What do you think, Konstantin? How does that sound to you?
Optimistic.
Well, that sounds good. That optimistic. I like optimistic. Yes, sir.
You know,
Actually, what I'd like to do is, now that we're all here, I'd like to also bring Alexandra back on stage, please, and just basically have the same discussion as we're having with you. Ask Alexandra a couple of questions, and then we'll wrap it up. So, as far as the vocal music, what does Schubert bring, in your opinion? What does he bring to the world? You know, of course, he wrote over 600 songs. We know that, and he wrote for 20 unfinished 20 stage productions, as the history goes, and none of them were successful, or many of them were not even staged or finished. But of what he did do, what do you think he gave us? What do we remember him for?
It's funny you say that his stage productions weren't successful, because in his Lieder, they were kind of like a type of staged production. Like you saw in König, it's like an entire opera, with the accompaniment basically playing like an orchestra and with the characters. So certainly he brought characterization to Lieder, and any vocalist, when they think Lieder, they absolutely think Schubert as being the pioneer in this genre. And certainly he added a lot to the melodic line, making it more singable. He really took into account the voice and its expressive capabilities.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think some people think he's a tunesmith, as the word in English goes, but he is a lot more than that. He actually, I believe that he creates the prototype of the future melody by deriving from folk tunes and deriving from basically street folklore. Somebody asked him, you know, why do you have all these, you know, common man songs in your music, in your symphony music, for instance? And he says, "You fools, it's how the music should be." So I do agree with that, Alexandra. Thank you very much. Well, it is almost time to do a wrap here. I really appreciate everybody here. Konstantin, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Julian, thank you very much.
it's my pleasure. Hey, can I just say one thing real quickly, Sergei?
Yeah.
You know what? In this current time of social distancing, I'm seeing a lot of much smaller ensembles popping up that used to be parts of orchestras. I think now is a perfect time to bring out Schubert.
You know, that is a very interesting thought. We're actually trying to make this program timeless, but the people in the future who get this on a disc that flew out to space on one of those Mars missions will now know what we're going through. But thank you very much. So with this, let me say that we are done with the session here. This is session 5, Schubert, Composer's Lab. I hope you learned a lot today. And on behalf of the Interactive Academy, we wish you happy composing.